Hi everyone, it's Laura Caruso with a short presentation on the importance of the Electoral College. And to go along with this presentation, I've developed a set of little worksheets so you can kind of track with me. So if you have access to those, be sure that you have them printed out and ready to go. The last page of those worksheets is actually a fillable Electoral College map for you to use the night of the election itself. So I'd like to begin where we should always begin, and that is with Scripture. What does God have to say? In Deuteronomy 1:13 through 15, we see this. Choose for your tribes wise, understanding, and experienced men, and I will appoint them as your heads. And you, the people, answered me, Moses, the thing that you've spoken is good for us to do. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise and experienced men, and set them as heads over you, commanders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, tens, and officers throughout your tribes. Now, guys, what we see immediately is that there are some biblical principles of civil government that are laid out in this short passage. This is describing the civil government that was set up for God's people. They had escaped the slavery of Egypt. They're now in the wilderness. And what is it that we see in the form of their government? Well, there are three really important principles. The first is representation. The idea of local leaders that are chosen by the people themselves. Did you sense that? Did you get that? That Moses says, choose for yourselves. And the people say, that's a great idea. And they do so. And he appoints them as heads over small groups, all the way down to groups of 10. So we see representatives chosen by the people, those that are wise and understanding and experienced. We also see the idea of voluntary consent. I hope you caught that as well, that Moses presents this and the people say, this is a good idea, let's do this. We also see this expressed in other parts of the Old Testament with God's people as the law is set in place, the perfect law of God. They have the ultimate constitution that governs over everyone. Everyone is answerable to the law. But when that law is presented, God commands Moses to bring the law to the people and then to bring the people's answer back to him, which Moses does. And so again, we see this principle of the voluntary consent of the people being the foundation of all legitimate government. And then finally, we see the idea again of local self-government, not of a top-down system with Moses as dictator ruling over the people, but power distributed down to the most local level and the people choosing those most wise and understanding representatives to rule over them. Why is that important? Well, because it's biblical. It's God's way. It's a way that preserves the God-given rights of the individual. And we see those ideas providentially preserved in English law. Now, this is a story for a whole other class about how that came to be, that these ideas were preserved in one unique place on this little island of Britannia, and that they were grown over the years, expanded during the Reformation, and then those ideas were planted in the English colonies in America. And then, in God's perfect timing, a new nation was born. And that's your nation. This is a unique opportunity in all of history, you guys, when a brand new nation is formed. Because there's an opportunity for actually building a civil government from scratch. And so they pull from these biblical ideas, and that's the foundation upon which they build. And so the reason I lay all that out for you is that the Electoral College, the subject of our chat today, is a part of that system. It's designed on the foundation of biblical ideas of civil government, and it's designed to preserve the individual liberties of the people. So the founders knew that representative government was a great safeguard of individual liberties. It was a check and balance between the tyranny of the one, that top-down dictator form, and the opposite extreme is the tyranny of the mob, absolute anarchy. So what they gave us, they called a constitutional republic. Now, anytime you see republic, that means there's representation. And that's what we have as a constitutional. There's an overarching law that applies to everybody, and it's a representative system. And that is a very good thing. I know I dropped some words there, but that's a very good thing. So to be sure you understand, in a pure democracy, rule is by 51% of the total popular vote of all qualified voters. The popular vote would be the total votes of all the qualified voters in a particular election. This is a classroom deciding what we want to have for lunch, pizza or Chick-fil-A. We raise our hands and 51% make the decision. Now, guys, when it comes to small decisions like what we're having for lunch, sometimes a pure democracy is okay. But when it comes to the big issues of life, the fact is that God knew and our founders recognized that man has a sin nature, that he is, number one, easily swayed, he's easily deceived, and that he tends to pursue what is not right. His heart is desperately wicked. And that the masses, if left to a decision of the 51%, that we'd be in trouble very quickly. So that's why they built a different system. Thomas Jefferson said a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49. He recognized the need for protection from a system like this. Benjamin Franklin said it in a very typically humorous way. He said, democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. And then followed it with, liberty is the well-armed lamb contesting the vote. So recognizing the need for armed resistance if necessary. So all that to say, he recognized the danger of this purely democratic system and resisted it. In fact, when Franklin was asked, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us, when they were finishing up the Constitution, he said, we've given you a republic if you can keep it. And guys, he would say that because remember, a republic is based on choosing wise, understanding, and experienced representatives. Well, who chooses them? You do. So ultimately, the responsibility falls on us to choose these wise, discerning, experienced, and understanding folks to rule. The founders who put together the Constitution were representing 13 independent and individual states. Their states were of different sizes, different economies, different national heritages, and even different religious practices. Although all were Christian, there were different expressions of that. So they wanted to be careful to protect the expressions of Christianity in their various states, the different economic interests that they had. They didn't want one large populous state, for example, Virginia, dominating all the others, setting policy for Delaware and Rhode Island that would negatively impact them, or perhaps transgress or take away some of their religious rights. They saw us as a union of states, but with most of the power delegated to those states and the local governments within them, down at the thousands and the hundreds and the 50s level, right? They knew it was going to be very important to maintain local self-government, or the sovereignty of the states, if we wanted to protect the unique interests of the people in those states from being dominated by a central government in Washington, D.C. The founders never, in their wildest dreams, viewed this nation as a big mass of Americans who were going to be ruled by a 51% vote of all those people in the 13 states. That's not what they've, in any form or fashion, envisioned. So was not this big collective of people, and once we got to a 51% majority, that's what everybody has to do. By contrast, they saw us as a collection of individual states whose individuality had to be protected. In fact, at that time, one would say, when you were talking about the United States being free and prosperous, you would say the United States of America are free and prosperous. That probably sounds foreign to our ears today because we're so used to thinking of ourselves now. We've been trained, we've slipped into thinking of ourselves as one large amalgamation of people, and that's not who we are, and it's dangerous to our survival. So it's not the United States of America is, it's the United States of America are free and prosperous. Now, one of the ways that our founders protected those smaller states from being dominated by the larger ones was in how they established our legislative branch, our Congress. They established 2 houses in Congress, the U.S. House and the Senate. So here is my little drawing, the House of Representatives on this side and the Senate on this side. So in the House, the more populated states, the bigger states like Virginia, like Massachusetts, they would have more representatives. And that system has carried over even to this day. So today, you guys, there are 435 representatives in the House of Representatives, and they're all apportioned according to population. So for example, Florida has 27 of those 435. Now there's 50 states. So if we divided it up equally, everybody would have less than 10 representatives, right? About 9. But Florida has 27. Well, that's because we have a large population in our state. So we should have a little more influence in this body, in this side of Congress. We have more influence here. But over on this side, Florida has the same influence as Delaware or Rhode Island or North Dakota, who have far less population, but over here we're represented equally. So here is our representation in the House. I mentioned to you we have 27 representatives. Here are the 27 districts across the state of Florida. And in this election, every one of these representatives that's going to serve us in Washington, D.C., they're all up for either re-election or, you're voting on who you want to serve you. I live in the 4th district, so I'm choosing between John Rutherford and, I've forgotten her first name, Deegan, Karen Deegan. So I'm choosing between 2 candidates here in the 4th district, and most of my students live down here, 9th, 10th, 15th, 11th. You're in this area, so you too are choosing by 51%. Okay, that's where the Democratic part comes in. You're choosing by 51% the person that you want to represent you, and then they go and serve in the House in that group of 435. They are part of what's called the Florida delegation. As opposed to, here's New Mexico. Because they have such a small population, they only have 3 seats in the House of Representatives. But remember, over in the Senate, everybody is equally represented with 2. So New Mexico has 2, and Florida has 2 on the Senate side. This is to prevent Florida and Texas and California from just running the tables and really running the whole nation. So these 2 houses have to work together. One cannot pass laws without the agreement of the other. So these smaller states are able to veto things that they think are detrimental to them. Guys, that's the system that your founders set in place on purpose so that smaller population states would not just get run over and their interests ignored. So the 2 houses have to agree. Now, the reason I explained this to you is that this is the same system that we use to choose our president. So it's designed to do the same thing. It was established in our Constitution in Article 2, Section 1. It was then later refined a little bit with the 12th Amendment. But the system is called the Electoral College. And the Electoral College, much like Congress, it gives the individual states more influence, particularly states with smaller populations, as a safeguard. So this was a safeguard put in place by the founders to keep major population centers, at the time it would have been like Richmond and Philadelphia and New York, from controlling the destiny of the whole nation. This is essentially what a direct national election would do as well. A direct national election, if we look at it as just a mass of people and we just took 51% of the vote, it would essentially eliminate state borders. And it would allow your presidential candidates, it would allow President Trump and former Vice President Biden to focus in just a couple places where there's heavy population, and they could run up the score in the high population areas that favored each of them. So it's not this, because here is a population map of the United States. The dark blue areas show where lots of people live. And so again, it would allow these candidates to just focus on parts of Florida, heavily populated parts of New York and Massachusetts up here in New England, but really ignore most of the states in the United States. They would just focus on heavy population areas. So I think it's easier if we think of it kind of like this in football terms. So the National College Football Championship is not determined by the total points scored by a team. For example, Clemson's football team does not play all their games and then add up their total points at the end of the season and compare those to the total points that were scored by Auburn. because this policy would actually discourage true competition. Needless to say, Clemson would just run up the score against all their weaker opponents like Kent State. And they might not even give their best effort to defeat Miami or some really strong opponent. They just need to not lose by a whole lot, right? But instead, the way it actually works is in the National College Football Championship world, you have to get a W in every game if you're hoping to win the championship, or as many as you can. So you have to compete in each game. That's kind of how the Electoral College works. We don't want them to just run up the score in a high population area where they can. We want them to have to compete in state after state. So the Electoral College system keeps them from running up the score in a few areas that favor them, and it forces them to actively compete and address the unique interests of voters in North Dakota and New Mexico and Delaware and Rhode Island. They have to consider small states and large states all across the nation. You can't win with just the big states. So how does it work? Well, remember, what we don't do is direct election through the popular vote. Now remember, the popular vote in the presidential election is the total votes of all the qualified voters in the United States. So, looking at my little map here, even if the popular vote were to look like this, with the Republican candidate up by 6 million votes, it does not necessarily mean that the Republican candidate won. And that's a good thing. This is where people will say, well, that's not fair. But guys, it's more than fair. Again, the system is brilliant. It's purposeful, and it's designed to protect the individual liberties of Americans. So instead of just that single direct election, what actually happens is a two-step process. I want you to understand it. On Election Day, this year that is Tuesday, November 3rd, there's a separate popular election for president held in every one of our 50 states and the District of Columbia. So in Florida, we are casting votes for either, well, there are several candidates that are running for president, but most are casting votes either for President Trump or former Vice President Biden. And whoever reaches the majority is the winner of Florida. Then what happens are the states, that once the state of Florida knows who our winner is, we cast our assigned electoral votes. Officially, we don't do that till December 14th, but we're going to cast our electoral votes, and that's what elects the president. So two-step process. What's happening on Tuesday, November 3rd is the first part, and then we can deduce, even though officially we don't do the second part till December 14th, we can kind of know by the night of election on November 3rd what's going to happen with that. But it's a two-part process. So what are those electoral votes that the state casts? Here's how that works. In the summer, before a presidential election takes place, each of the major political parties in the state, which for years have been the Democrats and the Republicans, each of them chooses a group of people that will serve as electors if their party's candidate wins the majority of the state's popular vote on Election Day. So again, whoever wins the popular vote is going to win the electors. Each state is given the same number of electors that it has in its federal delegation. So again, we've introduced to you the House and the Senate, and that's how we assign electors in the same way. The number of representatives that you have for your state plus the number of senators you have for your state equals the number of electors that you have for your state. So in Florida, we have 27 representatives. Of course, we have 2 senators. So we have 29 electors, or 29 electoral votes. So whatever our state decides, Trump or Biden, at the end of the night, one of those candidates will get all of the state votes, 29 votes, towards the presidency. So I popped in, this is my current representative, John Rutherford, plus there's 26 more representatives. Here are 2 senators, so 29 electors. Now, the Electoral College, that term, just means the entire group of electors representing all the states who cast their votes officially on December 14th. They don't all come together at a big conference to do it. They do it in their states, but they are called the Electoral College. Now, clearly, a state's representation in the Electoral College is mostly based on population, right? Florida has a big crew. But small states are all guaranteed how many? 3. So no matter how small they are, they will have 3 Electoral College votes, even DC, the District of Columbia. They have a slightly disproportional influence, but that provision protects those smaller states from being run over by the interests of the larger ones. Here's a blank Electoral College map. So you can begin to see how this works. Here's Florida with our 29 Electoral College votes. But Rhode Island, they only have 4. Wyoming, 3. South Dakota, 3. Nebraska, 5. So this part of the country would largely be overrun. The interest would be ignored if candidates were able to simply focus again in those high population states and areas. Something else to notice right quickly, who has the most Electoral College representation? California by a long shot, 55. Next is Texas with 38. And then tied for third place is your state. Florida has 29, as does New York. So in order to win, the candidate must have a majority of the electoral votes. So let's do the math. Let's figure out what a majority would be. What's the total number of the House of Representatives? We saw it earlier. 435. Plus 2 senators per state, 50 states, so 100. Plus the District of Columbia has been given 3 Electoral College votes. So that means our total is 538. So a majority is half plus 1. So half of 538 is 269 plus 1. 270 is what it takes to win the Electoral College. That's the number. But it's very hard to get there by just focusing on the large states or just one region. Candidates for president are forced to consider the concerns of all parts of the country. Let's look at the current map. So as of yesterday, these were the projections. These are polling. This is a conglomeration of polling results from a source called Real Clear Politics as of November 2nd, 2020. Now, whatever you might think of polling, a lot of people just kind of dispense with this, but it does help us get a look at the map and some of the predictions. So when we look at this map, we can see that for the Biden-Harris campaign, the dark blue solidly, they really think this one's going to go to that campaign. The light blue is likely. The pink, likely Trump. The dark red, we think is definitely solid for President Trump. And then the gray, guys, are all the states that are called toss-ups. So again, this is where we stand on November 2nd. Here they have 270 votes are needed to win, and how things look in the moment. And as we look at this map, then we see that there's some pretty significant states that are toss-ups at this point. Candidates cannot win with just the large states. They have to be winning, or they have to have a winning combination of small and large states to put them over the top. Now, of the toss-ups that we see in play right now, the second biggest prize is Florida. And quite frankly, Florida is probably, of the top 2, the most in danger, or the most hotly contested between Texas and Florida. So, yes, you live in one of the most valuable pieces of political real estate in the United States. But guys, only 14 million of about 18 million adult Floridians are registered to vote. And of those registered, only about 75% are expected to vote. Now, this year is a little different year. So I gave you that prediction, and it may actually go higher than 75% this year. We are in a historic time with historic enthusiasm. All that to say, if it's a typical year, that means about 58% of all the adults in Florida will decide for everybody, and maybe even the nation. Our state's that important. 58% of adult Floridians decide how the vote goes for the president. That puts a heavy burden on us, doesn't it? Samuel Adams' quote is kind of an important one to consider in this moment. He says, "Let each citizen remember at the moment he is offering his vote, he is not making a present or a compliment to please an individual, or at least he ought not so to do. he is executing one of the most solemn trusts in human society, for which he is accountable to God and his country. He is to be voting to preserve the system of civil government that God has set in place. Now, some parts of the process differ slightly by state, but 48 states do it like Florida does. So here's what should happen. Each major party has already chosen 29 people who will serve as electors if that party's candidate wins in Florida. So by 7 p.m. on Election Day, Tuesday, November 3rd, all the registered voters in the state of Florida will have had an opportunity to cast their votes, however that by mail, early voting, in person. So the in-person voting day of will then close, and any ballots received at the Supervisor of Elections office after that time will not count. That is set out in Florida law. So here's vote counting. Now, when all the votes in each county are reported by their Supervisors of Elections, then the next step is that the Secretary of State for Florida, a lady named Laurel Lee, will certify the results. The electors then for the winning party, whether it's Democrat or Republican, those 29 people will be officially notified, and on December 14th, 2020, that winning team will ceremonially cast their ballots in Tallahassee, and then they are sent to the President of the Senate in Washington, D.C., where they are officially counted on January 6th of 2021. But that really is all ceremony. We usually know who the states have voted for on election night. So we already know which of the electors are going to be participating in the Electoral College. We can already predict who the president will be on election night. But this year, of course, because it's 2020, may be complicated. There are some states that are making changes in their election processes, particularly in the use of mail-in ballots. And while normally mail-ins are all supposed to be in and countable by election night when the polls close, some states are making exceptions, and some states have had those exceptions upheld by the Supreme Court. So all of that could lead to more legal battles that prevent a clear winner from being declared on election night. Also, if the Electoral College results as they're coming in, if it looks like it's close, then it is likely that there will be lawsuits demanding recounts in the states where the vote was close enough to make a difference in the overall result. Now, all states have to declare who their Electoral College votes are going to by December 14th. And this is from an article called Save Election Night, where the author says, if even one swing state is still dithering on December 14th, it's possible that neither Trump nor Biden will have reached 270 electoral votes. And then the decision will be thrown into the brand new, we're electing new representatives, guys, on Tuesday, November 3rd, too. They will have taken their seats, and we will then toss the decision to that House. The House of Representatives would decide. That's according to the Constitution. This hasn't happened since 1876. And certainly it would be another source of tremendous political drama in a year where we don't need any more. Then the final piece of drama that could, unlikely, but could occur, is legal challenges could finally put the decision in the hands of the Supreme Court. Well, the problem there is we have a brand new Supreme Court justice, and it's not known whether Justice Barrett would actually recuse herself, if she would say, I'm not going to participate in that because it's an election-related case and I came to the bench so close to the election. So if she chose to not participate, that would leave 8 judges to decide, possibly resulting in a tie, which would really prompt us. It would put us in the place of a constitutional crisis. That just means we need to pray. We need to be obedient and do what we're called to do and cast our votes with a biblical worldview. And we need to pray. We need to trust God. It's a great reminder, as I was reminded several years ago during an election season, that obedience is ours and results are His. This brings me to the last sheet in your packet, which is the worksheet that you have, the fillable election map. So guys, as results are coming in, you'll want to, or you may, color in. Typically we use blue for the Democrat Party and red for the Republicans. You can color in those states as they're announced for one party or the other, for one candidate or the other. And then if you want to keep track of how close they are to 270, you can actually tally for yourself. So for example, probably New York and Massachusetts will come in early and announce that they are, Vice President Biden has won those states. So 29 Electoral College votes, right, in New York, and Massachusetts has 11. So you go New York, 29 votes, tally 29. Massachusetts, 11 votes. My new tally is 40. And you just keep tracking downward until we would get to 270. Same thing on the Trump or Pence side, where you'd fill in the states that they had won, perhaps Florida with its 29, and then adding West Virginia with its 5 would bring you to 34, and you'd continue down. Again, just reiterating that we need 270 to win, and we may not know, or we may indeed know on election night. It's kind of a crazy year, so we'll just have to wait and see. I'll be along for the ride with you, and I too will be trusting in God, in the sovereignty of God. This is something that need not stress us out as Christians. God is still on his throne, regardless of the outcome. Duty is ours, results are God's. At the end of the day, we go back to one of our national mottos, right? In God we trust. I hope this is helpful to you, and look forward to seeing you after the election's all over.